All right, now we come to the second part of our lecture on the Enlightenment, the enlightened thinker. We're going to survey a number of different thinkers in the Enlightenment and how they drew on Platonic and Aristotelian thought and how they developed Platonic and Aristotelian thought. And there's three things I want the student to get out of this section. First, I want the student to be able to identify the Platonic and Aristotelian elements within these philosophical systems, within these thinkers. Secondly, I want the student to evaluate the value that Descartes, John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume have to the Christian life. Are they helpful for understanding God, or are they not helpful for understanding God? Are they helpful for understanding the world around us, or are they not helpful? And finally, I want the student to be able to examine the Hume's theory of skepticism. I think Hume has some very interesting things to say. I don't really agree with him, but you have to do something with him because they are legitimate objections. So let's start our time with Descartes. René Descartes developed an approach we call Cartesian rationalism. Again, Descartes was a mathematician. He developed a Cartesian coordinate system named after himself. Leibniz drew on Descartes for his own mathematical work. Descartes, unlike Newton, did not trust his senses and doubted the information that his senses provided him. This sense of absolute skepticism caused him to go a little crazy. Descartes was not necessarily the most emotionally stable guy, and he kept thinking about doubts, how he doubted that this could be real, and he doubted that that could be real, and he wanted to find something he couldn't doubt. For example, he wondered whether or not the world around us was made up of real things, a real physical material world, or if his brain was sitting in a vat somewhere and was hooked up to all these electrodes, and this evil genius was sending impulses to his brain to make him think that, hey, this table is real, and this wall is real, and this person is real, when in fact they're just electrical impulses. And that this evil genius was sending these signals to him that supported the idea of a God when no such God existed, no such table existed, no such person or wall existed. It's called the brain in a vat theory. And it was also the foundation for the Matrix movies. This idea that reality is not necessarily a physical reality, but our mind can be tricked into thinking the sensory information is accurate. This is an early epistemological challenge. This challenges the nature of truth. Not because Descartes wanted to bring down a notion of truth, as Descartes was searching for something that he knew to be true, searching for something he could not doubt. And once he found that something that he could not doubt, that became his first principle. And he can build everything else on top of something that he could not doubt. And he doubted just about everything. He doubted that others existed. He doubted that the world existed. And the more he thought about this, he did come up with one thing he could not doubt. He could not doubt the fact that he was doubting. This does not sound all that helpful to you and I. But to him, this was profound. It started out, dubito ergo sum, I doubt, therefore I am, and we know it as cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This was a first principle that he knew by necessity, by definition, had to be true. So he could start constructing his view of the universe from this one indubitable fact. Notice the method here. Descartes doubted the reliability of his sensory information. So if you doubt the reliability of sensory information, Aristotelianism can't help you. Cannot help you. And this is in stark contrast to Newton, who wrote an entire text on optics and the reliability of, what is seen. Descartes did not necessarily support the Newtonian method of observation. This was known as rationalism. Notice Descartes could develop his theory of the world without reference to observing the world around him. He thought that these observations actually distracted from truth. And here we see another synonym being introduced for this Platonic worldview. We talked about Platonism and the world of ideas. We talked about rationalism. We talked about deduction, a deductive method whereby you deduce from principles, not from observation of the outside world. That same mode of thought is now going to be referred to as a priori. In other words, that you can know something before you sense it, prior to sensory information, prior to examining the physical world. It's something that you can know in your head alone. So again, we see the persistence of the Platonic worldview. It's not that the Platonic worldview was thrown out. So we have this competition, and in different eras, Platonism or Aristotelianism was emphasized over the other. And even though we're in a period of time in the modern era where Aristotelianism was emphasized more heavily, Platonism was still there. Okay, let's compare this to another major thinker of the Enlightenment, John Locke. John Locke usually is talked about in reference to a system of government. Unfortunately, the limitations of this course prevent us from getting into all the cool little parts of Lockean philosophy. But he was not a Cartesian. He was not a rationalist. He was an empiricist. John Locke had this belief that when a person is born, they were born a blank slate, what he called a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And as one observed the physical world around him or her, it made these sensory impressions on this blank slate. And this is how one gains knowledge, through the senses, making sensory impressions on this blank slate. Locke rejected the idea that someone had innate knowledge, or someone was born with any knowledge that was not gained through the senses. This methodology, this empirical methodology, was known as a posteriori knowledge. In other words, knowledge that comes after, posterior to sense impressions, posterior to examining the world around us. So on the one hand, we have Cartesian rationalism, a priori knowledge. And on the other hand, we have Lockean empiricism, a posteriori knowledge, that serve to illustrate the way in which the Enlightenment appropriated classical thought. This is how the Enlightenment period chose to explain these two divergent classical values, Platonic knowledge and Aristotelian knowledge. And these different methods had significant consequences, especially in religious thought. John Locke was a Christian, and he wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. Among other writings, he wrote supporting Christianity. So again, don't assume because there was this rise in what we call a scientific worldview that people in this era thought that science supplanted belief in God. No, that these thinkers, Locke included, used empiricism in order to articulate their vision for the Christian life. Okay, and one of the key parts, especially for Locke, was miracles. And he wrote an entire treatise on miracles. Miracles were observable phenomena that could not be explained through natural law, whose purpose was to point to God and God alone. They were unique violations of natural law that supported the presence and activity of God in this world. Okay? That's important because it demonstrates the method. They were observable phenomena. Notice Locke is not pointing to Anselm's ontological argument where he comes up with this abstract definition of God. Locke isn't using a rationalistic approach whereby he starts in the mind and then works out into the world. No, even with his Christian faith, Locke is using the observable phenomena in this world to support his belief in a God. Now, there's some debate as to how well that vision of God matches with our modern evangelical vision of God. Sure. But it's not like science was making religion irrelevant. And sometimes that's the impression that we get when we study the Enlightenment. By no means is that true. So we have Cartesian rationalism, we have Lockean empiricism, we have a third way here, and this is very interesting to me. My philosophy professor in undergrad was a huge fan of a guy named George Berkeley, and he was a British bishop that used Enlightenment thinking to take a belief in God, a belief in the world around us, how we organize the world around us, in a slightly different direction. His approach is known as idealism, Berkeley's idealism. Berkeley believed that matter did not exist. It was only a perception in the mind of the perceiver. Now that's interesting because did Berkeley believe in a physical universe around us? No. But did Berkeley believe in the value of sense perception? Absolutely. So it's this odd mediating position in between rationalism and empiricism. For Berkeley, if something was to be real, its reality is not rooted in the physical world. It's not rooted in this abstract world of ideas. For Berkeley, he puts it in a specific place. Reality is found in the mind of God. And if this desk exists in the mind of God, if that wall exists in the mind of God, then it has reality. Then it has reality. My undergrad professor, Dr. Danaher, had a very interesting way of approaching this. He took this question: if a tree falls in the middle of the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a noise? Now, scientifically speaking, the answer is no. According to physics, in order for that tree to make a noise, you have to have a transmitter, a medium, and a receiver. In other words, a tree that transmits a noise, air would be the medium, and someone to hear it, a receiver. Plato would answer that question differently. He'd say, yes, it would make a noise because that noise exists as an idea. Aristotle would probably say no, because the noise is not part of the observable world. If no one's around to observe the noise, then it can't be verified and therefore does not exist. Berkeley would say yes. When a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, it does make a noise because God perceives it. It is perceived in the mind of God. Is Berkeley a good illustration of the Platonic worldview or the Aristotelian worldview? He has a very interesting middle-of-the-road position. I think he leans towards Aristotelianism only because the observer that matters most is God. Since God perceives it, it is real. So Berkeley developed an epistemology, developed a theory of truth that's entirely dependent on the activity of God. And this is superintendence in its highest form. That if God were to ever stop perceiving that chair, just for a second, that chair would cease to exist. That every moment of every day, reality is sustained by the direct activity and thought of God. So again, Berkeley is a great illustration of how Enlightenment thought this this belief in an Aristotelian worldview and a mechanical universe was not used to throw out God. It was a lens through which Christians articulated their faith. The fourth thinker we're going to think about, and we're going to discuss in this section, he is a very effective critic of religion and of the Enlightenment itself. David Hume, Scotsman, lived in the 18th century, and David Hume had a problem with causation, or at least had a problem with how the Lockean empiricists conceived of causation. Hume very simply and effectively called into question the relationship between a cause and an effect. He argued that you can't assign a cause to a particular effect because causation is not something in the observable world. Let's say we had a pool table and we had a rack of balls at one end and a cue ball on one end, and someone would hit the cue ball at a certain velocity and would strike the rack of balls and the balls scatter. Okay? The average person would say that cue ball caused the scattering of the balls. Hume would say, prove it. If reality is determined by what can be observed in this world, how can you observe causation? If reality is determined by what is observed in this world, how can you observe causation? And Hume was drawing on a logical fallacy, post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. And what this logical fallacy says is you cannot prove that thing A caused thing B, or action A caused action B, simply because it came after it, regardless of how proximal those two events may have been. In other words, you cannot say that the cue ball caused the scattering of the rack simply because it came in contact, the cue ball came in contact with the rack and then the rack of balls scattered. Because you cannot show me, not in a microscope, not with infrared technology, not with anything, you cannot observe causation. This usually gets my students up in arms, and they say, that's ridiculous. Here's the problem. It's not ridiculous. It makes sense. That doesn't necessarily mean it is an accurate description of the world around us. It is a coherent argument against observation. Now, in order for something to be true, it has to be both coherent and it must correspond to what actually happens. This, in my opinion, has coherence, doesn't necessarily have correspondence. But if you are going to talk about the observable world around us being, a reliable guide to knowledge, that's a problem when it comes to causation, because causation is not observable. We just assume these things are true. We assume because it happened proximal that action B, the scattering of the rack, happened proximally to the action of the cue ball, and happened immediately after, that there must be a cause and effect relationship there. And here's the thing, if you throw out causation, Christians have a huge problem. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument no longer have any value. Hume was in this conversation with Locke, especially on miracles. If we cannot assign causation to something, then according to Hume, you can't say this miracle happened as a result of something that God did, if there's no observable cause and effect there. So Hume skepticism was an enormous challenge to both Enlightenment philosophy and the Christian world. Now, how this was solved, I think was somewhat humorous, and at least supports the power of Hume's argument. In Scotland, directly after David Hume, there was a group of philosophers known as the common sense realists. And these common sense realists did kind of admit, hey, Hume, you're right. I cannot necessarily, on a chalkboard, demonstrate for you causation, but it caused it. Like, come on, man, it caused it. And it doesn't matter if we cannot prove scientifically or other words that the cue ball hitting the rat caused it. We're just going to say it caused it. That's where the common sense part of their name is comes from. And I think, A, that's very appealing to us because students don't like to accept that Hume was right. Students can't accept that Hume was right because it will, the whole world would come crashing down around them. Not that Hume could cause anything, according to Hume, but there is a sense that even though we cannot directly refute Hume, we all recognize that that's not how the world works. So Hume's argument is a very powerful one, and it at least serves to highlight a major weakness in this Enlightenment project. If you're going to base knowledge, either completely or primarily, on observation, there are things in this world that are very real, but yet not observable. And I think causation falls into that category. Other people might put God in that category. Is God observable? Is God not observable? Well, you obviously cannot make any claim for God being observable if you do not hold to some view of causation. But Hume correctly found one of the major weaknesses that the postmodern era will magnify, that if you're going to base knowledge primarily on sensory perception, what about the things in this world that can't be perceived? Okay. Again, a lot of material here and a lot of things to chew on. We left out so much. We left out a ton. But I hope that you got a sense of how the Enlightenment era appropriated how the modern era appropriated classical thought, how they wrestled with Plato, how they wrestled with Aristotle, and the effect that these classical opinions had on the development of the modern era. Now, what we're going to talk about next is how this Enlightenment thought impacted how culture developed during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, because these are not just philosophical arguments that nerds like myself are arguing with other uber nerds. No, these are ideas that were debated in the salons, quite literally in France. These meeting areas called salons, where hubs where ideas can be discussed and debated. They shaped how we develop new approaches to government and art and economics. And so these are not abstract ideas, and this is why we're going through a course like this. Ideas have real consequences for how we live our lives today. So if we're going to live rightly, we must first learn to think rightly. Thank you.